I thought maybe before we just launch into Q&A, maybe we could just take a quick pass, a minute or so apiece, and just make a statement or a comment or introduce yourself if you haven't been introduced.
Hello, it's very good to be here. I wasn't expecting to be sitting on this panel, and I would have paid a little bit more attention to the day. So if you're expecting some intelligent, witty, pithy comment, you'll be disappointed. But I'm fizzing with excitement. It's been a great day, and what's interesting me is this intersection that we're starting to see between the language of science, the language of shamanism, and the language of mysticism. And what seems to be emerging is this interesting interface between all three. And I may say a little bit more about this tomorrow, but it's very exciting.
No, I was quite impressed with the first contribution, because it's always a little underestimated when we have neuroscience meetings. People just speak about the brain, not too much about the psyche. And I liked it very much, the introduction you gave, Bill. And spreading it out from the realms of the psyche, from the mystics to the psychological functions, even speaking about a little bit of science. So it started with a very good feeling for me, and also all the other contributions, the practical things, which mostly are overgone in medical discussions, just speaking about symptoms, and you treat the symptoms, give some medication, that's it. And I think it was well organized here, and Neil did a very good job keeping things together. Normally the chairman has to watch the time slots. So, and Erwin I have never met before, even I know the homepage, so I have to send them a number of papers to update them a little bit. It's great. Okay, that's all I have to say now.
So, as we were preparing our talk, we decided that we were going to try to throw in some of our little world wisdom we've learned in our lives, which is where that lovely little communications section of our talk came in. And one of the others that didn't make it in, and so I'll give it now, is lack of sleep makes people crazy. People so often talk about their experiences with psychedelics and the after effects that they experience afterwards. And of course, they just stayed up all night long and didn't get any sleep. And it's important to take that into consideration. A lot of people, as they get older, describe that they start tripping during the day instead of at night.
We had, I remember I was early 20s and interested in psychedelics, and someone said, related to that, someone said, adults take their drugs in the morning. I was like, the other bit of wisdom was that we were going to add, which we did, lots of things got cut because 25 to 30 minutes is very short for us. Anyway, is start low.
Wise advice. Yeah, I found that I'm liking the tripping in the morning more and more as well. I don't know. I am happy to be here presenting with all of you. I like the variety of different presentations that we've had, and from the very neurological and sciencey to the very nerdy. We've had like everything, and I'm just happy to be a part of it.
I too am very, very happy to be here, and can't help but reflect on the 15 years I was very involved in this research until 1977, and then the long silence when it became dormant until about 2000, where I always wondered if it would come alive again in my lifetime, and it indeed did. And now at Hopkins we've been doing it for 9 years, and there's I keep thinking of the Liebestod in Wagner's Tristan and Isolde, if you know it, where this very romantic soaring music, and then it dies down and it dies down and it gets completely silent. And there's a couple measures where there's just a soft timpani, and there's more silence, and more. And then the theme comes back ever so gently and softly, and then it builds and it builds and it builds until it's more glorious than it was in the beginning. And wouldn't it be great if psychedelic research does that? I'm quite willing to adjust to it going into the underground again. It's been doing that for a couple thousand years. You know, it emerges and it gets suppressed, and it emerges and it gets suppressed. But right now, it's emergent time, and it's very exciting and very hopeful, and it's wonderful to be here with all of you.
I'm quite grateful that we're all here together, and that Kevin and Neil have done the work that it took to make that happen. It strikes me as very important because this is not very underground, and this is part of the reemergence and talking with one another and talking with many people that are not in the room here today. A context that I have learned to hold for all of this is actually pretty personal. The word religion is a loaded word for a lot of us, but there are people who have written that there's actually a common core to the world's religions. That's somewhat disputed by some scholars, but others, including Aldous Huxley and Houston Smith and many others, have said, no, when you get right down to it, there's a core experience that reminds us about the true nature of self and the asserted ultimate reality of interconnectedness. And to be very personal, I'm on a path of remembering that for myself. Huxley, towards the end of his life, said about all the world's religions, there's these huge tomes and complicated practices and teachings and whatnot, but what at the end of the day is it all about? He said, really, can we all just be a little nicer to each other? That's like the common messages he distilled into the world's religions. And for me, the litmus test of that is, how do I respond when presented with challenge? When something hard happens to me? How much jealousy, anger, hurt, contraction do I experience and project back out into the world? And the sacraments, the medicines that we're talking about today, over time, it seems to me, can improve that. And many other things, including and especially community, can improve that. So I know that we all have communities of one form or another. Part of my message and hope is for us all to have more of that. It seems really to help. Thank you.
I'm glad I have this opportunity to speak to everyone again. I, in particular, want to address something that came up when people approached me after I spoke. There was a common theme that I noticed, and sometimes it's a direct question, and sometimes it's the question behind the question. I want to address those of you who have expressed an interest in getting involved in this kind of work. It's kind of a small group right now, but it is growing. And what I would like to encourage anyone who's interested in contributing to do is start by volunteering. Unless you're affiliated with a research institution of some type and have other connections, volunteering is really an ideal way. And ask yourself, really, what do I have to bring to the table? I'll share with you that my in was the fact that I had worked in the corporate world and I could make a damn fine PowerPoint presentation. It doesn't necessarily have to be, years of clinical experience, although that is very valuable and you should think about including that. So I encourage you to volunteer, become a member of MAPS, contribute to the Hefner Research Institute. Start by just making those connections. And just on a personal note, it's kind of unlike me to say something like this, but I kind of can't contain it. I'm just overwhelmed with gratitude that women's voices have been well represented here today. And if there are any women out there thinking of getting involved, I really encourage you to do so, because one of the valuable lessons that we learned working on the psilocybin trial was just how important it is to have both genders represented to support participants, because you never know, are they going to need mom, are they going to need dad, are they going to need doctor? So I'll end with that.
Okay, so on all that note, how about some questions or discussion for our assembled panel here? Gentleman down here.
Perhaps not the most important question that will get asked tonight, but it's something that's been troubling me for about a decade. So I figured if ever there was a panel to ask, there it is. You know, most of the information that I got growing up about LSD either came from personal experience or weird old hippies. And, you know, well, weird old hippies might be really knowledgeable, it's not necessarily guaranteed. So there were always these rumors around the dead lots and stuff about, like, this LSD is beige crystal, or this is silver, or this is white, and I've always kind of figured that's gotta be BS, but I don't know, and I keep hearing it. So what is it that actually makes one batch of LSD different from the next?
All right. So there's several layers of different answers. The simple answer is who knows? And, no one, as far as I know, really knows how to answer that question. The second layer is that looking at that pretty hard for a couple of years, what we found is that there are probably other things that are very similar to LSD that are not well documented, that have been sold on the market as LSD, that are not readily distinguishable, but that is...
Also, breakdown product, LSD can break down into very related chemical so depending on age and manufacturing process, they can have different levels of sort of just the pure, exactly LSD, or it could have broken down some.
And there is exactly no data to support the view that, no scientific data to support the view that that's what's going on. There's a lot of experiential data. People reliably report over time that this acid was different from that acid, and this definitely didn't feel like the same as that, the blue acid or the red acid is totally different. And yet, there's counter evidence as well. There are people whose job was for long periods of time to aliquot LSD onto individual doses. So you're taking a gram of LSD, let's say, and breaking it up and putting some on red blotter and some on blue blotter, and people coming back and saying, the blue blotter was the good stuff, and the red blotter was crap. And so talking to LSD producers and talking to people who've experienced very strong differences provides a complicated and a complicated pile of data that, in sorting through it, we found no real answer to.
There's also a big issue of dose that, you know, low dose versus high dose can seem like very, very different effects. And so that's certainly a component of it.
Is pure LSD white? 100% chemical pure LSD, is it white? A white crystal?
White crystals, yeah, white to clear crystals.
It's like quartz is white, I guess, in little tiny piles of powder. It's white or clear. Yeah.
Thank you. Other?
Absolutely pure crystalline LSD, which you should not have access to, is a pure white powder.
Thank you.
Pardon me, I'm a little shy, but I imagine we're all kind of purists here, and I wanted to mention that using psychedelics in conjunction with certain audio frequencies, specifically from 7 to 4 hertz, that's beats per second, can result in a kind of major acceleration of the phenomenon. And for all my research I've been doing, what unfortunately is limited to the internet, I haven't seen anything mentioned about major acoustical, especially psychoacoustical integration with the psychedelic experience, which is kind of funny when you consider that a lot of the material regarding DMT and, of course, LSD, you have major, the psychedelic rock, major oscillations, waves of sound bombarding the individual. But if you combine this, I found, with a binaural beat, which, you know, that iDozer thing is a terrible representation of what kind of amazing sort of states can be induced in conjunction. And also, while sober, there's a gentleman from NASA named Tom Campbell. He started off as a nuclear physicist, but ended up doing work with the Monroe Research Institute, and found that a lot of the states, and this is going to be unfortunate for purists, but a lot of the states that are very similar to psychedelic states can actually be achieved. Unfortunately, it's kind of like playing the piano in the sense that you have to work at it. It's not like the chemical rush. But I think this is an area that deserves a lot of inspection, especially given that it seems to be connected to psychotropics, which is, of course, the research that was done from the 70s into today, where you've got people doing very strange things with non-local awareness, data gathering. Remote viewing is, of course, the gross term for it. But I was wondering if any of you had any knowledge whatsoever with powerful oscillating waves, binaural beats, in conjunction with, let's say, neurophysiology.
I'll say a few words around that very good question. You know, I've been very involved in the choice of music that we use during sessions, and I think the whole field of research in music and consciousness is wide open. You know, there's all kinds of wonderful studies that need to be done and can be done. A few years ago, I had the opportunity of being in India and visiting Tenzin Chogyal, a younger brother of the Dalai Lama, who's a tulku. And I was sitting with him in Dharamsala, you know, with the eagles soaring around and the white peaks of the Himalayas. And, you know, what can I learn from this man? This is such a great opportunity. And I said, Tibetan music, you know, where these alpenhorns and special gongs, the theory that different frequencies might trigger different states of consciousness. And I said, Tenzin, tell me more about Tibetan music and consciousness. And he looked at me and he said, Bill, what really moves me profoundly spiritually is Beethoven's Pathetique Symphony. You know? And he brought me right back to and I think you know, that doesn't mean there isn't profound discoveries to make with frequencies of sound and stuff. But there's something about the Kyrie from the Bach B minor Mass, the Samuel Barber's Adage with the strings, that we shouldn't dismiss. You know, we get so enamored by electronic music or whatever that we tend to miss some of the great treasures that are part of our Western heritage. And so both and, I would say.
Other questions? Somebody who's not asked a question before? Sir.
Hi, just continuing on the gentleman's inquiry and question. I'm an ethnomusicologist, and I've done research on altered states that are achieved through musical playing and musical understanding. And these are widely known all over the world. Some cultures give them names, some don't give them names. They're found all over Africa, South America, Central Asia, and so on. One particular state is interesting, which happens in classical Arabic music, and that state is called tarab, which is high levels of enchantment, ecstasy, euphoria that's achieved by the performers and the audience members who heavily rely on each other, each other's interactions. The skilled musicians cannot do it without the judicious listening of the audience, who signal to the performers that they're with them by either uttering a specific stock of sentences, words, or nonverbal commentaries. But the interesting part, which is common between all of these musical cultures, is that the music that's used is very often non-tempered, which falls in the harmonic series, the overtones. That would be quite interesting to focus on that if one intends to do research on that, where classical music is incredibly inspiring, and I'm classically trained. I think that it's really hard to go into these altered states unreservedly through tempered scale. And we notice that in Indian music as well, where non-temperament is used. And there are various forms of non-tempered scales used here. And very often these musical systems include microtones. For those of you who are not familiar with microtones, these are the notes that falls between the black and the white keys on the piano. So it's very interesting to focus on the non-temperament aspect of the scales and how they fit in the harmonic series, because nature presents to us music that's, to us who are trained in well temperament, which is something that happened in late Baroque period. It was around the time where Bach wrote the well-tempered clavier. It's just functionality, but it does not agree with what nature wanted to give us.
I wanted to agree with that as someone who plays a non-tempered instrument. To go back to your original question, I think it may be less the actual frequency that's important, but the frequencies that are important. And so if we look at psychedelic music in Western culture, in the 60s, it was all based on guitars going through Marshall stacks turned up to 11. And the archetypal, the iconic instrument of acid house was the Roland 303 bass line, which produces very harmonically complex waves. And I think that's possibly the important factor, that there's something about these very rich waveforms. You wouldn't necessarily want to listen to a flute to get into these states.
Hi. I was wondering today whether there would ever be a psychedelic pharmaceutical company in the future. And I know this is a bit of a slippery slope argument, but do you think that psychedelics, once legalized, have also the potential to become corporatized and marketed and advertised in the same way that Eli Lilly would Prozac? And what do you think some of the pitfalls of this might be, and can it be avoided?
The two parts of the question. One, I don't think that they will become too corporatized because they're off patent, so they would be generic, and there shouldn't be a lot of money to be made off of them. And then the first part of your question, that once they're approved for a condition, they can be prescribed off-label for other conditions as well. So it's not going to be restricted to just treating that certain condition.
I'll make a comment on that insofar that we work sometimes with the industry. The mainstream now is that the pharmaceutical industry, they want to leave the filing of a drug as it has been done in the last 50 years. For instance, you find a compound for depression or for schizophrenia, because we understand more and more about brain functions, let's say memory, visual memory, verbal memory, all these components. The pharmaceutical industry is looking for compounds that enhance this stuff. For instance, we have 2 studies running into cognitive enhancers. I'm not allowed to speak about which one, but specific functions will be enhanced. Or take Viagra as also a function. So if that is reached, that opens the field that you can prescribe something not for depression, but for everybody who suffers from depression. Maybe he's schizophrenic, he's depressed, maybe he's an alcoholic, he's depressed. That's a thing of the market. So the mainstream thinks in money, and it's function-driven. And it's not true that they don't know what's going on in our field, because I just came back from 2 conferences from Europe where they discussed that. There was a workshop sponsored from the pharmaceutical industry about ketamine and ketamine derivatives. And they have their own compounds because they are not blind. They saw that if you give a depressed a little bit ketamine, mood goes up, and then you throw in something else like an SSRI, serotonin reuptake inhibitor, and you keep the patient on a good mood level. There were 3 studies, American studies now, published on that stuff with ketamine. So what I have seen, lots of is confidential, but we are interested in these compounds. They certainly will patent this stuff, and they will certainly not use ketamine, but they understand how ketamine works in the brain. It enhances glutamate. And they think just in that kind of term. I'm convinced in 20 years we have lots of psychedelics, very fine-tuned, but it's only possible because some greedy guys can make money.
With your thinking about that, how broadly do you define psychedelics in order for that to be true?
Yeah, that's what psychedelics, okay. But I could imagine a compound that loses controls, gives you a feeling of unity, if I understand. What's involved in that stage? Okay, it's a kind of psychedelic for 2 hours or 1.
Well, it seems inevitable that there will be cognitive enhancers and general life function enhancers, and many of them will be under patent protection. And in various countries, they'll be marketed in different ways, whether they're prescription or not. So we'll just need to deal with that and hope for the best. There's a reason to be hopeful that big alcohol and big tobacco are not the models that will be followed. You know, those are both off patent. And look at how wisely our culture deals with those psychoactive substances. The difference, of course, is that they're habit-producing in many people. And it is to the great benefit of those companies to generate brand allegiance and heavy use of the products as early as they can in people's lives. And that, by and large, is not a liability of the materials we're talking about here. The other thing I would say is that there's a variety of materials that don't need to be manufactured in factories. There doesn't need to be, an FDA-approved facility and regular testing of the white powder output. They can be grown in gardens and in greenhouses and in basements. So I find it helpful to look to those materials because it bypasses the supply problem.
I'll just make a brief comment that's somewhat tangential but related to this topic. And I just want to acknowledge that among people in the research community now, I'm not aware that there's any sort of consensus around some of the larger policy issues. And for example, on our own team, we got to talking one day about, what are we doing? Where are we going with this? Let's say tomorrow psilocybin were to become legal. What are we going to do with it, apart from it being approved for certain indications? One member in our team said, it should just be prescribed like any other medication, write a script, get whatever training's required and go for it. Whereas others on the team were thinking, I really like the model of a treatment center with trained facilitators and so on. So as a community, there are much larger policy questions to be addressing. And that's well out of my scope of expertise, but I think anytime we're talking about these substances as pharmaceuticals or prescription medications, it's important to think about the bigger picture about, legality, who will have access to what, and how will it be distributed. So there's a kind of another layer of questions that go along with that.
So I have a question about the issue of intent. So I agree that in controlled set and setting, as in, with trained facilitators and psychotherapeutic setting, that intent for self-improvement is very important. But, most psychedelic use that takes place in uncontrolled environments, people with varying degrees of preparation. And so I've worked in harm reduction for past 7 years. And I've seen many times people who are very knowledgeable and very well prepared in some respects for these experiences, their use of psychedelics actually, instead of leading to personal growth, actually reinforces megalomania or narcissism or other negative or counterproductive aspects of their personality. And so I've struggled a lot with what to tell people who are just starting out their explorations of these substances, especially young people, how to approach the experience. Because I've definitely seen many instances where people who take it too seriously in some respects actually, end up going down the wrong path. And so I'd like to know your thoughts on that.
Accept feedback from your peers. One of the main kind of control rods that we have as humans is we have people around us who are part of our family, and I think that there's a way in which I agree with the observation that it can be people can become kind of isolated as they increase their use around psychedelics, especially if there's definitely some interesting spaces to be experienced, in the introverted world, and without, the kind of, one of the things that really struck me, when I was kind of first interested in these subjects, sort of 1988 to sort of 1994, was really just how available they were, yet without a tradition of how to use them wisely. I was left, sentence here, finishing part here. I felt like I was first offered LSD in 1987. I was first offered ecstasy in 1987, and basically I was being advised by other 18 to 22-year-olds, and while that was the context. I was in college, and that sort of makes sense. It's a little crazy to have 18 to 22-year-olds advising other 18 to 22-year-olds on how to use these incredibly powerful substances. And, I think that the best thing that I can tell people is ask your friends if you're acting crazy, and accept their views, that if they say you are taking them too often, or acting kind of crazy, that maybe you should cut back.
Yeah, I've come to view these substances as just intrinsically sacred. And, even if your agenda is to use a small dose and just have a one time with your friends, as if you were smoking pot. I think psychedelics often evoke a very deep agenda within consciousness. And it might not be at all what your ego would like to plan for that evening. And so often, the so-called bad trip is that something really important is emerging, and you are just not in a place where you want to deal with it, so you try to avoid it or repress it or run away from it, and then you get into panic and paranoia or confusion, and then you say, oh, it's bad drugs. It's not bad drugs. It's that you're maybe invited to come to terms with the death of your mother, and you'd rather not, or that the psyche is presenting a growth opportunity for you that really is includes some pain and suffering, and I just don't think at least
basically the front of the church is right down there. That street is
drugs. That there really are profoundly sacred substances. And one reason our culture has gotten into so much trouble with them is that when they appeared back in the 60s, we didn't have any framework to know what to do with them. and we treated them as if they were party drugs. And I think that kind of blew up in our faces, really. So that's my perspective, whatever it's worth.
Bill, could you say what you mean when you say that these substances are intrinsically sacred?
That they give access to not only a whole variety of states of consciousness within, from the personal to the archetypal to the mystical, but that they also kind of release a very creative process within the psyche. I call it the entelechy of the interpersonally grounded psyche. But there is a, when you look at what happens in a moderate to high dose session, when you go into that session with total openness and trust and willingness to deal with whatever comes up, usually what comes up is profoundly, brilliantly designed for you at this point in your life. You know, as if there's a piece of the unconscious that has already written a 3-act opera and is just waiting for you to experience it. And there it is. And it may not be delightful, but it may be profoundly helpful and meaningful.
We end up being a little bit of a hub for bad trip experiences people describe, and so I mean, I definitely like. I'm not sure how to get to the space of believing that every experience is sort of a part of the entelechy of the collective. Say it again.
The entelechy of the
interpersonally grounded psyche. Wow. That's. I feel really good about that because you've actually been present for a lot of people having very powerful experiences, and so that makes me feel good about the world.
Thank you for having the conference. Most of the stories that I heard today are the consequence on the individual of a psychedelic journey. And first, obviously, I'm grateful. Having been raised under the heavy shadow of religion, psychedelics was a way for me to open up to a realm of the transcendent that was not so confined. So in that sense, I'm very grateful. But my question is, what then is the consequence, not on the individual, but what is the consequence for organized religion if psychedelics were to be legalized and distributed on a broad level? What would be the consequence on organized religion's relationship to state power, to its mythical imagery, to its sexual morality? So, thank you.
That's a big question. It's not easy to say, but certainly sociological theorists of religion spend a lot of time looking at sex, and that's S-E-C-T-S, sects, and schism in religion, and generally mystical experience is seen as destabilizing by religious authorities because you have in a religion you have a set of rituals and a liturgy and so on and so forth, which is said to guide people to the divine. And if someone comes along and says, but God spoke to me, follow me, that is destabilizing because obviously people go off. It's impossible to say what would happen. We may see the demise of Orthodox religions. We may see their revival in opposition. We may see them incorporate psychedelic sacraments. But my sense is they would initially see them as threatening and would try and rail against them.
I actually have, microphone. I have a little bit of experience with this in that for a dozen or more years, I've attempted to reach out to representatives of the traditional organized religions. Not in any broad kind of way, but going out of my way to meet people, have lunches and dinners. And I don't know if I would characterize it quite so much as resistance, although I'm not dealing at the institutional level so much, just kind of a deaf ear. About mysticism, Brother David quotes somebody as saying, look at the word carefully. Mysticism, it starts with mist, ends in schism, and has I in the middle. So that's how some people, religious and otherwise, regard mysticism. Another thing that I'd like to acknowledge Brother David for is putting in my mind the idea that religion can be seen not as a static thing of asserted truths about the world and power hierarchies and rigid rituals and whatnot. It can be seen as a living system. And mysticism is the way that it gets renewed. It's like, old things complete their cycle and new things come to replace them. Every person who has a mystical experience under good conditions, such as we've been talking about, has an opportunity to re-envision and re-language and reform the traditions and the community and the rituals and so on. So I don't know what it would look like for the substances to be legalized and then have institutional religion respond. I suspect that most of them just wouldn't. And that there would be new traditions, syncretic traditions that would spring up and let the spiritual marketplace see which ones do the best good in the world.
And if I can come back, the classic debate was between Aldous Huxley and R.C. Zener. Huxley in 1954 published The Doors of Perception, claiming that he'd had the archetypal mystical experience after ingesting mescaline. And Zener, who was I think he was a professor of religion or theology at Oxford, wrote, he didn't exactly condemn Huxley, he disagreed with Huxley. He allowed that Huxley had had a mystical experience, but he created a typology of mystical experience in which auto-generated ones were not taken so seriously. So he was saying, okay, Huxley, you had your experience, but it wasn't a proper mystical experience because that is in the lap of God. It's delivered by the grace of God. You can't just dial up a mystical experience. So in that way, that kind of puts flesh on those bones of why it's destabilizing to organized religion. But I think you're right, we would see new syncretic religions emerging as we have with Santa Daime and churches like that.
Yeah, Zener.
Zener, sorry.
In those days, he wrote, his article was called The Menace of Mescaline.
Yeah.
I remember. And, his argument was, and he was a very esteemed Roman Catholic scholar at Oxford, that, there are two flavors of mysticism, essentially Western and Eastern, the unitive, non-personal consciousness and the personal relation to the Christ, the archetype. And what he didn't comprehend was that the same human being, whether Eastern or Western, can experience both of those. That they're both they appear to both be in the repertoire of many human beings, both the personal relation with the archetype and the unitive mystical consciousness beyond it. And it's not that one is only for Eastern people and one is only for Western. So, I mean, just what responsible research with psychedelics can do to contribute to the knowledge of how the mind works and contribute to religious knowledge in academic sense is profound. Zener also, you may know, at one point he finally took mescaline himself and he had a very mild aesthetic experience that wasn't mystical, but he published it as proof that mescaline doesn't produce mystical experience. And he just didn't understand it. But he meant well.
I'd like to comment that a little bit. it's very difficult to say, did you really have a mystical experience? Where is the top? It's always when we use our questionnaire, only a few subjects come on to the top of the questionnaire, none of the experience that is possible. And as we were in Dar es Salaam with the monks to measure them, we tried to use the same monks also in the psilocybin setting, but they were not allowed, at least those monks, to take drugs because it's not worked through. We could then get 4 Swiss Dalai Lama monks because they have a monastery in Switzerland, and they said it's more or less the same, but the visionary beginning is not what they want. They want the second phase of the psilocybin or LSD experience, where it becomes very calm, very deep in, also boundlessness, but not all this so-called artificial worlds and imagery. This is just the devil. It's not the real release of an imagine or a picture of the world or whatsoever. So this is my contribution. I want to say what's mystical. It's hard to define. Just a few words, categories, and what's the top. And I personally don't believe that the psychedelics would change religious behavior. I think first people have to be on a way, or you need a concept, and then the drugs can help to go there. But I don't think that if people would take, if it would be legal, psychedelics, that something would change, because we had done that in Europe. People have taken lots of LSD, and in the States, nothing happened. Us, not much.
Thank you. It's really interesting to hear you all. I'm going to try and form this question. I've been sitting with it, but there's a couple things I'd like to hear some of you address about, going back to the concept of community, rituals to help our youth, because in traditional societies, this is very powerful medicine. And there are often rituals involved in introducing, and there's purposes for it. So I think, to keep it simple, I'd like to understand, I think with your experience and your knowledge, how would you see us as a community? Coming back to not just individual, because we're so fractured now, and we are fracturing with the new technology and the change we're going through. How would you envision for the future, given where we've come from, rituals, coming back to community, women being involved, bringing back to the hearth, some of the things that seem arcane but are really important in this realm? And if you could talk a little bit about some of those things, I hope that's clear.
I actually led a workshop at the Symbiosis Gathering in Yosemite last weekend, and I took a corporate tactic again and brought it into the community and structured it in a way to facilitate kind of a meeting. And I asked people to imagine that they were delegates sent from various factions to kind of document what the shared vision is. And we started with the very basic question when we talk about the psychedelic community: who is that? Because you hear people refer to the psychedelic underground, the others, the family, the tribe. And we had some discussion around that. And I think the dialogue is pretty fresh and wide open right now. We asked questions in 3 categories. It's a corporate strategy I learned for leading kickoff meetings. And when you bring a client team and a vendor team together, and they called it gifts, gears, and sharks. And for our purposes at Symbiosis, and to not be guilty of any copyright infringement, I called it gifts, gears, and narcs. And the gifts being, in 5 to 10 years from now, what do we want to be saying as a collective community? What have we given the world as a result of all this effort and dreaming and money raised and so forth? And we generated a fascinating and very diverse bulleted list. Then we switched gears and talked about switch gears, 2 gears. What are the mechanisms we're going to have to put in place to realize this vision? And then the narcs or sharks, or what are those risks lurking beneath the surface? And instead of just proactive issue spotting, we talked about who holds the net that's going to catch them and so on. And so I'm in the process right now of developing a summary report, almost like a business meeting. And it's fascinating. There are some areas where there is consensus, and some areas where there's still very divergent opinions, because you have input coming from, it was almost like central casting had a hand in bringing this meeting together. There was someone who was sort of representing the shaman and the neo-shaman and the people interested in mystical spiritual concerns. There was a young guy who'd never done a drug, but he was a scientist. He was worried that doing a psychedelic might impair his ability to do his job, and he was putting in his request for credible research. And there were artists, there were writers. It's so multidisciplinary. It's a difficult question to answer succinctly, but I think that's where we are right now in history. Is this where do we agree? Where is the consensus and cohesion? And where are our opinions divergent? So I wish I had a more specific answer, but if you'd like a copy of the report and see what people at the Symbiosis Gathering are thinking, I'd be happy to forward it to you.
We need to close down shortly, so we won't have any more questions, but I don't want to just leave the answer to one. If anyone would like to make other comments, please do. And this will be the last set of comments, and then we'll see you tomorrow. Please.
I'm not entirely sure whether this comment addresses the question exactly, but one of the things that I see as being a function of community around sort of the strongly mind-opening psychedelic type drugs are containered spaces where people have some definition around what is a beginning and an ending and an opening and a closing, so that there is people aren't driving home while they're high or whatever. There's an acknowledgement of a shared responsibility within that container, and whatever that container is, whether that's an hour, a day, a week, a month, a year, whatever that container is. I think that's a function of a spiritual or religious community that's very important around these substances, because I think that one of the things that I think a lot is that psychedelics are sort of a destabilizing force on a personal level. I don't know whether they're destabilizing on a community or a historical level, but it's creates fluidity where there was not exactly that fluidity before, and I think that containers are a big part of what communities can do, what families can do, what groups can do.
I think we have time for one more comment from the panel. Who wants the last word?
I had forgotten something to say, something funny from Europe, Germany and Switzerland. There was the idea to educate young people, that's cool, like about sex and all that stuff, about psychedelics and drugs, but it's done really. But then to make a driving license. So some people in Germany pushed that for the government, that should be about 2022, and you go into several sessions where you have guided LSD or psilocybin experiences, and then you get a license. That's the plan.
Okay. Well, I hate to stop it because we have not had enough time for this panel, but we have to let the door people go and whatnot and clean up here. So thank you very much for the panel. Would you please help me thank the panel? Thank you so much.